All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to this episode of Lean In Olympia. I'm Corey Passons. I'm here with Interfaith Works. Interfaith Works is a nonprofit located here in Olympia, Washington. We're a coalition of 30 plus diverse faith communities and affiliated organizations. We're also one of the region's largest social service providers to homeless adults, to adults experiencing homelessness in our region. And this is Lean In Olympia. It's a bi-weekly podcast of conversations at the crossroads of humanity, justice, and belief. And if you want to check out past episodes or stay up to date with the work that Interfaith Works is doing, please go to our website at interfaith-works.org or check out the Interfaith Works Facebook page or YouTube channel. And now we're hosting this podcast on Spotify as well. So there's a lot of ways to stay connected with what we're doing, and we want to stay connected with what you're up to as well. So please be in touch. Our guest today is Amy Sommers. Welcome, Amy. Hello.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Hello. You are an author, lawyer, consultant who spent 3 decades as an international lawyer, including 11 years working in China from 2004 to 2015. And you returned to the United States and noticed a degree of political polarization and a rising threat of violence in American society. Mm-hmm. And this deeply concerned you. This is from your bio that you've crafted. Since retiring from the practice of law in 2016, you've worked with a range of civic and organizing endeavors. Today, we'll be talking about the way that you and I have come to know each other through the work that you're doing with Cure PDX as they address the rise of extremism and radicalization here in the Pacific Northwest. You live in Seattle, Washington, and you're joining us from your home located there. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here.
Yeah, well, it's great to have met you. And I think that the work that I referenced prior with Cure PDX is something that we'll come to. Olympia is a small town, but we have been host to a wide range of extremism and expressions of political angst and even aggression and violence. And so we'll talk about that. That's the way that you and I have come to know each other and work that we hope to do in collaboration together, especially as we're approaching yet another election cycle and when a time when these kinds of expressions tend to find form. So I'd love to talk about that and some of the unique ways that Cure PDX thinks about extremism. Just wanted to first get grounded in your story and ask you if you could help us know who you are and where are you from and what's your, tell us about your origins.
So I was born in the Pacific Northwest. And I grew up in Seattle in a part of Seattle that was very special to me and still is. It was the Mount Baker neighborhood. And this was a beautiful neighborhood south of downtown that amidst the white flight of the 60s and the ending of the racially driven covenants around housing had become multi-ethnic, multiracial. And so when I was growing up, it was about a third Black, third white, and third Asian, with people from Japan, China, Philippines, both, generations ago, and newer immigrants. And it was really, this was in this, second half of the 60s and 70s, and it was a place that was, that really thrived on being diverse, and people saw that as a strength. And every day you were going to school with people from all these different cultural backgrounds. And if you were going to thrive, you needed to learn it was kind of like a little model United Nations almost. You had to learn to get along with people from these different backgrounds. And the dominant ethos was that it was good to have to do that. That was seen as a positive. And that's, I think, in contrast to a prevailing narrative that surprised me when I came back to the United States to live, that this idea that we find it painful to be in relation to people who are so different from us by their cultural backgrounds or their thinkings or their cultural habits or whatever it is. So I grew up in a place where that was seen as good. And I feel like that actually really played a key role in my professional career of becoming an international lawyer, because those of you who are listening who are from the Pacific Northwest and have lived here for a long time may remember that when China first started to open up after the Carter administration reestablished formal relations, the then dominant leader in China, Deng Xiaoping, made a whirlwind tour around the United States. This was in 1980. And Boeing was then headquartered in Seattle. And one of the things China needed was access to aviation because they wanted to modernize their economy and be able to move people around. And so Seattle was one of the places Deng came, and he toured Boeing. And I was a teenager then, and there was all this media coverage in the press about how this relationship, this emerging relationship, was going to become important. And the Pacific Northwest was probably going to benefit because we were a very trade-focused region of the country. And we historically had strong ties with various parts of Asia, and that there would be a need for people who had technical skills to be able to do business. And so I had wanted to become a lawyer, and I thought maybe I should focus on China, that would be something that would be needed. But of course, when I started going to law school in the 80s, that was when Japan was still very dominant. So a lot of the discourse or feedback I got initially was that there is no law in China and you're missing the boat. You should be doing Japan work. But I think part of the reason I was open to that was having lived in this very diverse community where the idea that you would actually try and learn to deal with people from a different culture and see that as a skill set was sort of baked into me.
So not only were you in a culture that, or at least a provincial culture that was welcoming you into receiving others, you embraced that. It sounds like yourself too, and you felt that call both in your professional life and into your lived life in Seattle too. Who were some of the people around you at the time that were either modeling that or who were important to you in some of these emerging responses? Well,
I think the church community I attended was weekly, evidence of this, where it was a Catholic church, St. Mary's, which sadly has just been closed by the Archdiocese, but it was very vibrant. In the 70s, they had the whole sort of folk singing thing, but they also had a traditionally Black choir-influenced strand of their music. And the adults in that community were just really vibrant people who were very welcoming of different ways of being. It was a gay welcoming congregation in the 70s, very early on. My sister and I, as a nascent feminist, thought it was wrong that there were no altar girls or only altar boys. So our parish priest approached then Archbishop Hunthausen, and he approved our becoming altar girls. And it was just a really great place. And then there were people who lived actually in our neighborhood who didn't go to our church, but were super dynamic people. And the man who was a longtime principal of Garfield High School was our next door neighbor, Mr. Bass. And they were, they talked very frankly at, neighborhood parties, they and other Black adults, about what it was like living in the Jim Crow era. Most of them were part of the Great Migration. We didn't call it that then, but they would talk about, like another neighbor talked about, he was very fair-skinned, his wife was darker skinned, and when they were living in Virginia, being pulled over by the cops because they thought it was a white man with a Black woman. And they could laugh about it in the 70s, but you got the sense that the things had been bad, and also the sense that, these people were all thriving, that things had become better. And so it was a place of hope, and maybe that dynamism was an inspiration.
That is so powerful as a young person to be literally at the feet of those who are telling you about it. It's such a different experience than reading about it in a book or having a teacher who doesn't represent that race or culture tell you about it secondhand or thirdhand. But to have that firsthand experience is very powerful. Yeah. I also love that story about Archbishop Hunthausen. I'm going to add that to my little collection of things I've learned about the man, the myth, Hunthausen. So that's great.
Yeah, he was such a force for good, and the Archdiocese of Seattle was better for having him around us.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to spend more time on him, but I want to get to some of the recent work that you're doing and how that could possibly intersect with some of the current situations that are here in Olympia and in the Pacific Northwests. But I want to ask if you could tell us a little bit more about this time of re-entry back into the United States. I mentioned the dates earlier of 2004 to 2015,
Yeah.
and during those times, it was a formative time for American, the political landscape, and even culturally too. There were a lot of dynamics happening and being exposed and being codified and fortified that we might not have even known about, and maybe we're seeing today in some ways. So, what did you experience upon that return, and what were some of maybe the surprises that you began to become aware of at that time?
Yeah, so when I left was we have to remember the United States invaded Iraq in 2003,
Mm-hmm.
at, and my husband and I decided to leave for various reasons. We had made the decision by the end of 2003, and I secured a job, and in early 2004 we left. And that autumn, and we felt very strongly that this decision to invade Iraq was going to end very badly, and that it had not been well founded, and we were going to spend all this treasure that had been built up. And there was a lot, bad things were going to happen. And so when that autumn in 2004, when Americans voted to reelect the man who had led us into this war that I believe was very unjustified, I was really disgusted and very pessimistic about the path our country was on. Then fast forward to 2007, and the presidential election campaigning was starting, and there was this young candidate who spoke very ardently about what had happened with Iraq and wasn't equivocating about it being a bad decision. And he hadn't voted because he hadn't been in the Senate at the time, he hadn't voted to approve it. And I saw around me, I was very involved, as I mentioned, because I was representing these big companies. I dealt with executives with these major corporations. I was very involved in the American Chamber of Commerce there. And to my surprise, these executives who tended to be sort of politically conservative, saw this candidate as somebody compelling. And partly, I think it was because they were living in this international context, and Barack Obama had grown up as what we would call a third culture kid. I mean, he had grown up part of the time in Indonesia and received these different cultural influences and opportunities to live between cultures. And so I thought, well, maybe this man is going to get traction. And so when he did and he won, I thought, okay, so now people realize we made a mistake, but we're on this path of seeing the possibility that an African-American man can hold the highest elected office in the United States. And that's amazing. And then, of course, part of what made it possible for him to be elected was the global economic crisis. And that coupled with many other economic trends that had been in place for decades, resulted in a hollowing out of America's middle class. So when I returned in 2015 and started being exposed really for the first time to these sort of cynical takes, like "thanks Obama," that thing that people used to say if something went wrong that had nothing to do with the president, like some local road was messed up, and I would hear my older son's college friends joke about "thanks Obama." I thought, so what is this? Is it the post-global economic crisis anxiety that people are feeling, or is it because he's a Black president? So I didn't have a fixed position on it. And I started, I became aware of a professor at the University of Washington, David Domke, who was a communications professor who had started doing these lectures about American politics and linking the communications around politics to seminal changes that arose because of the civil rights movement and the effect of the civil rights movement on American politics. And he presented a really, to me, compelling argument that what mainstream media was talking about as economic anxiety justifying this really wasn't that. It was the latent racism that had permeated our country, and the election of a Black man had unleashed this and made it acceptable again to bring forth, although under the guise often of economic anxiety. And I just became so transfixed by this and disturbed by it. And having lived in a country that was escaping a decade of horror, the Cultural Revolution, which unleashed terrible turmoil, destructive turmoil in Chinese society, and led to millions of people being in agony, dying, having horrible things happen to their families. I saw that our country, that I thought had this very robust democracy, was actually in a much more fragile place. And I felt like I needed to do something. I didn't know what I was going to do, to try and tackle a little corner of that problem. So that was the dilemma and the realization that hit me coming back to this place that I thought was really on this very positive path.
At that moment of transition from one presidency, which contained all myriad of hopes and aspirations for a huge number of people who hadn't yet had that kind of expression, to another kind of form that took on a whole other energy, right?
Yes.
So so this is the moment when you're coming back. So welcome back, and so you're here. Your work begins to shift at this time, and where did you then begin to associate and do your work in that period of time coming back?
So I did. As you mentioned in the introduction, I retired from the practice of law in 2016, and I did conventional political volunteering and mobilization work initially. And after President Trump was elected, and there was this, and then of course with COVID, this only accelerated, but I started to see that hate-filled rhetoric played a really strong, and I will use the word positive, role in aggrandizing power to the then administration and people who supported that administration. And I felt like political organizing was a necessary thing, but it was insufficient, because part of what was happening was the very existence of our democracy and the ways that it functioned were being discredited. And people were being encouraged to turn on one another. And again, this takes me back to having learned and spoken with so many people who went through the Cultural Revolution. I could see echoes of, and if one studied what happened in Central Europe in the 1930s, with the uptake of fascism,
anti-Semitism,
and anti-Semitism and communism in Russia in the 20s and 30s, where some group would be vilified in order to accrue power to the dictator or the dominant party in the state. It was deeply troubling to me. And so initially I worked on volunteering politically. And I mentioned David Domke, and he ended up establishing a nonprofit that has become a really important organizing force in arguably across the United States, where they take volunteers from the Pacific Northwest who tend to be older, people like myself who have maybe leisure time or disposable income, and also younger people who tend to be BIPOC people, and train them, and then they go do voter registration and voter turnout work in voter suppressed parts of the United States. So in Florida, in Georgia, in Texas. And so I did some of that work too. And getting to work with voters in what I would call voter suppressed states was really eye-opening to me. So this whole narrative that we hear that we should just wipe Florida off the map, or give up on them, it just enrages me, because there are so many good people in those states, but the people who control power have really disenfranchised them, and it makes it so it's so hard to participate in democracy there, and that could be a whole other podcast. But ultimately, I came up against the realization that political mobilization is necessary and yet also insufficient. And what made me realize that was in the spring of 2020, a couple of former national security experts, one from the Carter administration, one from the Clinton administration, wrote an article in the spring of 2020 warning that the then president was using hateful rhetoric particularly around the coronavirus, to demonize people and to make us fearful and turn us against one another with the hope. This was before George Floyd was killed. To turn us against one another and create angry riots in the streets that could be used as a pretext for disrupting or derailing the upcoming general election. And as I was reading this article, then you started to see this uptick in attacks against AAPI people because of the rhetoric around the Wuhan virus or the China flu. And you also saw the social justice protests in the wake of George Floyd's murders, and how there were protesters and counter-protesters acting out on the streets, and how that was the footage of those things were being used to convey this sense that the world was falling apart and that we hated each other, and our democracy wouldn't work anymore. And so when I spoke with the political organizers I was connected with about what could be done to deal with this risk, they said, politically, there is nothing that can be done because everybody's focused on the general election. And also, it's also incited and polarized at this point politically that trying to speak to people from a political standpoint is not workable. But when I spoke with mental health professionals about, well, what are ways that you can talk to people and not be inciting, not engage in fear-inducing rhetoric, but try and bring people together, they talked about the power of spiritual connection and faith-filled connection. And so it was in that context that I, with a friend, started working on a project that we called Morning into Unity, where we made connections on an interfaith basis in key places around the country to bring faith communities together so that people could grieve. I mean, we all felt terrible at that time, right? People were dying. We didn't know there was no virus. There was no treatment for the virus at that point. We didn't have these injections to take, and it was really terrifying. And so in that work, I started to realize that there was a deeper way for people to connect, and that has a power that is really to be still explored. And I became intrigued with that. But in that work, I started being connected with Cure Violence Global, which is the sponsor of the project you mentioned at the outset.
Well, I'd like to read a quote from Morning into Unity and just zoom in on that just for a moment too, because there's a beautiful quote from the website, which is Morning into Unity, and mourning as in the process of grieving, and that one does. So MOURNING into mourning, into unity, Morning into Unity. And from the website, it says, when we see our shared humanity, we strengthen our commitment to each other and to our democracy. This is a really, actually a very profound quote, because it talks about the response that's assumed when a person deeply perceives another person's humanity, which means that they also intuit the connection that they have with that person as their lot being shared with another. Famously summarized by Desmond Tutu through the description of the phrase Ubuntu. And what I also see in this is that this is connected with the experience we have of the democratic systems that support us. There's not a difference or a siloed experience between me understanding the humanity that I share with you and the democratic norms and efforts that we share together. There's not a distinction between those two. It's the same project essentially.
Yeah, that's right. And and it is by the existence of our democracy that we have a way in the public sphere to take care of one another and build a stronger and more resilient society. And faith is a really important part of that, and faith communities are a really important part of that.
They are in numerous ways too. They can be places that are bastions of isolation and homogeneity, fear mongering. I mean, there are churches that are literally sprung up that are patriot-based churches. I mean, somewhat stemmed off of the Christian tradition, but essentially in full nationalism mode is their dogma. But this project that you did was faith-based, but it was also multi-faith. I think you mentioned that before.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very
central to it.
important. I think that's something that is catches my ear as I work among an interfaith coalition, and we value the particularities, the differences, and the differentiations between our traditions, and we also value how we can work together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I watched some of that, and it was very powerful. Very powerful to see everyone together, unified, as in a place of naming humanity and shared humanity.
Yes. And we heard from so many faith leaders who expressed how they at various times have had strong interfaith connections in their communities, and then with one thing or another, they had, and maybe in large part because of COVID, they had sort of gone dormant, and they so treasured this chance to work together.
Yeah.
And I saw just how powerful and resonant it was to hear so many people from different traditions talk about the power of God's love to connect us to one another.
Yeah.
It was really, really beautiful and meaningful. And the relationships I made with some of the faith leaders continue to be really important to me.
I'm happy to hear that. That's great. Yeah, because one of the huge, with the pandemic happening, the isolation that occurred. We're still trying to understand what that is, and we're still coming out of that experience. It has changed us in some way that we're not able to fully express. But I really love how there's a quote from a retreat that you did recently, the Grieving, Healing, and Hope Retreat. And I want to share a quote from that too, because that's related to some of the work that you were doing with Mourning into Unity.
Yeah.
And it says, as much as we think that carrying on as usual will make us feel better, scientists, mental health experts, and spiritual leaders across traditions all know that the potential for healing and well-being in fact rests in spaces of shared mourning, connection, and oneness. I so appreciate this. It definitely resonates with anything I would say from my own specific religious tradition, but also what I've observed, in watching communities together too, that shared mourning is, it requires a vulnerability. Mourning is a very vulnerable space, and grief, sharing your grief with people, is a very vulnerable experience as a human, and it's deeply bonding when there's containers of trust that can be established where people can share. And it's also universal. We all have carried grief from this pandemic in our own lives as we've moved through it. So to have spaces to share that is a very powerful dynamic.
Yeah, in the retreat, the 4-week retreat that we just finished that you referenced, Reverend Dr. Matthew Fox said, there are two kinds of people: those who recognize they are grieving and are grieving, and those who don't. That we're all grieving. We all have faced loss in our lives at one time or another. And when we were doing Mourning into Unity, we spoke with mental health professionals, and one of the things they told us that was dangerous about that moment was we were physically isolated from one another because of the pandemic. We were hearing all of this inciting rhetoric, and we were scared.
Yeah.
And when you're scared and anxious and sad, and you have no constructive way to deal with that, it can make you very susceptible to anger and hate. And the work of epidemiologist Dr. Gary Slutkin, who was the founder of Cure Violence Global, and had seen the spread of viruses like HIV/AIDS or cholera in his work, he came to realize that violence is also a contagious disease, and violence grows out of unaddressed trauma and hate and fear. So if one of the imperatives is to address that and to dissipate it so that we don't then turn to violence, we don't see violence as a solution to the pain we're in. And I do think that being able to grieve with one another, our fears and our losses, is a place of vulnerability that helps heal trauma. The problem is that we're so terrified of being sad in our culture, in American culture, that it's very hard to get people to do it. Again and again, when I have done these grief-related projects, you're like, oh, I feel so much better afterwards. But getting people to show up and actually do the work is
Mhm.
hard, not because they don't think it matters, but because they're afraid of that they'll be so sad that they'll never get over it. And it's actually
Yeah.
the opposite.
Yes, yes. It's one of the ironies that that I observe in contemporary expressions of evangelicalism, if you will, or and I'm speaking from within the tradition, is that there's these deep reservoirs of wisdom in the tradition that I stand in that talk about the darkness
Yeah.
and moving into places of unknowing, uncertainty. Grief being one of those places where you give over some of your control and then you receive something back through that mystery of release. And it's just so ironic to me that these wisdoms, especially during times of year like tomorrow's the solstice, like we're moving into these holidays like Christmas and Advent that literally move us into darkness. But the recognition of the power of that darkness and that grief work is yet to be really endorsed.
Yeah. Yeah. And embraced
It's
by
hard. It's
our
hard work.
society.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is the place where I think your paths and mine have intersected. You reached out to me through your work with Cure PDX, which is you're a group of colleagues that are based around the Northwest, not all in Portland. Obviously, you're in Seattle, and you're working with some of the methodologies by the man you referenced earlier, Dr. Gary Slutkin, from the website. From Cure PDX. It's a project that seeks to prevent and reduce targeted violence and to transform the landscape of conflict throughout the Pacific Northwest. So first of all, you all have identified a landscape of conflict. That's kind of A, and then there's a process inside of your project to prevent and reduce. So let's talk first of all about identifying the Pacific Northwest as a landscape of conflict.
Sure. So those of us who live in the Pacific Northwest and love its beauty and value what is often seen as a culture of openness and welcoming, many of us are also aware that there is a history of extremism in this part of the country too. And starting a few years back, the FBI identified domestic extremism as the greatest terrorist threat or threat to democracy that our country faced. The Department of Homeland Security in 2021 agreed with that assessment publicly and has spoken publicly about how the Pacific Northwest has a very high concentration of extremists, both what we would consider on the far right end of the political spectrum and to the far left. And this project deploys the methodology that was developed by Cure Violence Global, which started out dealing with what we would call communal violence or gang violence. And then it applied its methodology to other contexts, including international contexts. And that methodology is a public health derived model where in a public health setting, you look at who is at the highest risk of transmitting a disease, and you try and change behaviors so that they don't continue transmitting. And you try and then identify people who are at high risk, even though they may them not yet be transmitting. And then you also try and deal with the public norms of behavior that need to be shifted so that you don't continue to have this problem. And applying that methodology to violence, what Cure Violence Global has done is develop this mode of identifying and training credible messengers. So people who are credible to the potential carriers of the disease. Here we're talking about the disease of violence. In the gang context, that has meant that you get people who have renounced violence in gangs, but who are seen as credible in those communities because they themselves used to use violence. And they then are able to talk to people and get them to stop using violence in the way that they had. And CVG's methodology has been tested by independent assessments and found to result in sharp decreases in violence in the communities that they've worked in. In 2020, which is when I connected with Cure Violence Global, they were shifting to seeing that this threat of extremist violence and political violence was an emerging and important threat to be addressed. And so they are working with another organization called Parallel Networks, which deals with people who are extremists and trying to get them off of that path of extremism. And so we are working together to tackle this problem in the Pacific Northwest using this methodology. And my part of it is to deal with the norm part. So I'm not somebody who goes out and talks to or recruits the credible messengers on the far left or the far right. But and this is where I think our connections came about, Reverend, is we all have a part to play in setting norms. And one of the problems when you have violence pervading your community, be it gang violence or extremist violence, is that you think it has nothing to do with you or it's not something you like, but it just sort of is, and you see it as inevitable in some way. And part of the challenge is to change that sense of inevitability, to create the sense that it isn't acceptable to use violence. And I believe strongly that faith communities, faith leaders, and people of faith have a role to play in affirming that we don't use violence to engage in the public sphere. And my hope is that we can mobilize people in the region to find ways to make that intention public and manifest, and to start to shift the narrative about its inevitability.
Can you talk about this phrase from the website, reciprocal radicalization? I think I know what this means. I don't want to step forward before. I want to hear from you about it, and then behind that, there's a question that I have about the spectrum of violence. So could you talk about what is reciprocal radicalization?
So one of the things we see maybe at holiday dinners with extended family is how one person takes an argument and somebody else in the family has a very different view. And
that's never happened, has it? Has that ever happened?
Those of you who have just gone to family dinner for Thanksgiving, are looking ahead to Christmas at the end of this week. And so you get more and more stuck down really in the conviction that your position is right. And maybe to, throw more fuel on the fire, you want to make your argument as pure as possible and the most extreme as possible to show that it's so utterly right. And to try and find some common cause or commonality would actually somehow weaken your argument and you and your credibility. That's, a dynamic we all recognize. And those of us who were either in the Pacific Northwest or maybe you were watching things on the news saw how there could be protest and counter-protest dynamics going on in the summer of 2020, where you had people who were protesting about the murder of George Floyd and wider racial injustice. You had people who were opposed to those protests come out. You had people who maybe were more extreme in supporting the social justice protesters and willing to use violence. And you had all of those forces engaging, and some of them were willing to use violence. Eventually, the underlying issue about the racial injustice and horror of George Floyd's murder, the oxygen in the room was gone because everybody was focusing on the people fighting with one another. That is that Mobius strip of violence moving back and forth and exaggerating and strengthening was very prevalent. And that is a danger when, this is one of the challenges we have when we want to express publicly where we stand. How do we do that without inciting violence and more hate and more intensity? How do we do that peacefully? How do we do that in a strong way, not in a wishy-washy way, but in a strong way that is not inciting?
One of
And
the features of your work and of your colleagues too is the use of data.
Mhm.
And can you remind me the name of your colleague who's the data scientist?
Dr. Towers, Sherry Towers.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So I organized a group of clergy here in Olympia, and we had a presentation. And what we learned were some, surprising facts about the ranking of Thurston County for susceptibility for political violence. We also learned about, when we're talking about reciprocation, how degrees of probability go way up when opposing sides essentially meet in the public square. And I think that
Yeah.
for me personally, just knowing that there's data behind, that 50% increase of probability of violence going up when one force is met with an oppositional force in a public square really gave me pause to think about the efficacy of, what is counter protest. And
Yeah.
it also becomes so ironic because the emotion and the energy to want to express your solidarity with a side is so natural and human and good. But one side, like for example, some press outlets that would feature only the responses of Antifa, right,
Mhm.
or whatever, however you want to name the counter protesting groups, but they wouldn't identify that there's an increasingly insightful dynamic in the norms of, say, policing, or in the accepted norms of persons who are more nationalist. So I think it really kind of humbles. It's a place of humility for folks to learn that we are just more susceptible to violence when we're close to each other and have differing views.
Yeah, that's true. And, Dr. Slutkin's work really examined how being exposed to violence um, makes our brains, it's not like we consciously choose this. It's that it
Mm-hmm.
actually, just like, the bugs that cause cholera settle in your intestinal tract. It's not like your body says, oh, yes, please come in and make me sick and make me almost die. It just happens. It's the
Mm-hmm.
same thing when we're exposed to um, violence, and our brains are affected by that and start
Mm-hmm.
to either become inured to it or to see it as a norm or even something to be desired.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so this
Yeah.
is why I keep coming back to those of us who see ourselves as in the middle. We're not out doing violence, or we're not extreme. We actually are affected by this, and
Mm-hmm.
we need to see ourselves as having a stake in this, um,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, and finding ways to manifest our commitment to one another.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that is, I think, really going to be our big challenge in the coming years.
That's the upcoming moment that Interfaith Works is looking to, collaborate with you and your
Mhm.
colleagues, and we'll be doing that. I think starting next month we'll be, really exploring ways that we can deepen that collaboration. But I mentioned the size of Olympia. Yeah, it's Olympia,
Yep.
Lacey Tumwater, but it's a smallish town, and yet we really saw some expressions of organized political violence across the spectrum. But I think that when you step back, you have to name that the examples of the most lethal and I think by far the most threatening expressions of violence came from folks who fall on the nationalist side of things.
Yeah.
And there were skirmishes in the streets. There were, a number of people have been shot here in the last couple of years at political events. The governor's mansion, was essentially stormed in a January 6th type of, event.
Yeah.
And yet we're coming up to another political cycle. And to date, I can't really point my finger at any national reckoning or softening of the kinds of like polarization that caused those events in the past couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that, yes, Olympia is population-wise a small city, and yet it is the capital of a state. And
Mm-hmm.
as a capital, it has symbolic significance to people who want to attack democracy.
Yeah.
And these images of people doing violence get shown around the country, either on televised media or online media, and
Mm-hmm.
then further incite people in other parts of the country. So it is what is happening in our communities in the Pacific Northwest, even if we see ourselves as not in a big city, actually does matter to
Mm-hmm.
our wider society.
Yeah, and you and I have talked too that one of the ways that faith-based communities and peace organizations can be impactful in this work is through relationship building, and this is difficult work to do. What are some of the ways that you and your colleagues are focusing on relationship, or how does that fit into some of the work specifically that's happening right now?
Well, I think you've really put your foot on, or foot or finger, whatever appendage
I'll put both on it.
on the issue is how do you build authentic relationships? Because
Yeah.
um, when you're asking people to motivate people within their communities or to come out publicly, they have to have a sense of trust. And one of the things we've found out in certain parts of the Pacific Northwest is that there have been instances where we haven't been there for one another in the past. And so when a community feels like they're being leveraged or used for political purposes, and I'll use the example of the African American community in Portland. It's a relatively small community. They get asked to come out on certain issues, and then they get neglected on a bunch of other issues. And so there's a lack of trust or desire necessarily to cooperate. Similar things can happen with the Muslim community. So part of what has to happen is we have to be in relation to one another, not just when we want something. And recently, with the uptick in awful anti-Semitic rhetoric, I asked a rabbi we've been working with if they had ideas of things that we could do in support. And the rabbi said they would think about it. And then the rabbi came back later and said, the rabbi didn't ask us to do a public vigil or anything, but said, I would really like you to read this booklet that's been produced about how to spot anti-Semitism and understand it, even if you don't think of yourself as somebody who's anti-Semitic, and to see it in discourse that occurs across the political spectrum. And so I did read it, and it was so helpful. It was so good. And I was so grateful that rabbi gave me something to do. Because I think people do want to do something. They just don't necessarily know what it is they should do. Yeah. So I think we have to be in relationship to one another on an ongoing basis. I think we have to be willing to ask people what they need and recognize sometimes our asking may feel like a burden, and it's okay for people who are suffering to say it's not on me. But if people do tell you they want you to do something, to try and find a way to do it. I also think that and this is the piece I still haven't figured out the how of, but I do feel that social media has a role to play, a positive role to play in amplifying the good connections that are happening. And so for people who listen to you, who get asked to go to vigils or to events and think, well, like I'm one other person, one tiny person, and I'm not material or I don't matter. It does actually matter when you see pictures on social media of a bunch of people and you realize, oh, there are people who care about this. It's not just me. And I think that was the dynamic actually that happened just a few weeks ago that people may have been reading about with China, with the protests against zero COVID. It's very dangerous to protest publicly in China. And for several years now, people have been very upset about the way that the COVID safety measures were implemented in China. For example, if you got COVID, even if you weren't deathly ill, you had to go to a quarantine center and you could be kept there for 10 days or even longer with no public showers. You had to use Santa cans, you just in a big room with people. Elderly people were going out and dying. It was really awful, but people didn't protest because it was dangerous. Well, when the protests started in early December, all of a sudden, I think what happened was people saw these other people out on the street saying the same things they had been thinking. And then that led other people to go out and make social media videos and show up, and it caught fire. So showing up does change the dynamic. And I think that's part of what we have to be willing to do.
Yeah. Well, Amy, thank you so much for sharing with us today about your work. And I look forward to Interfaith Works deepening a collaboration with Cure PDX and your colleagues there. I think we have a lot of good work ahead of us to do as we see the opportunity for relationship building in the midst of these seasons of polarization that we've been talking about and the heightened energies that tend to get stirred up during the political cycles. So we have a lot of opportunity and a lot of work ahead of us. I look forward to that work with you and your colleagues. And as we wrap up, I was wondering if you could answer a question that I ask each person towards the end of this podcast is how do you define hope? And where are you seeing expressions of hope today?
How do I define hope? I define hope as connection that makes you feel energized and gives you a sense of comfort. And one of my retirement list things I wanted to do was learn to tap dance. My dad was a huge fan of 1930s and 40s musicals, and we used to go to this tiny little theater in Seattle called the Rosebud Movie Palace that never showed anything after 1954. And so we saw tons of these movies. And so I was like, I want to learn to tap dance. And so I started last year taking tap dance classes, and I realized how hard it is and how I will never, ever be good at it, but I really like it. And this tap studio I go to is in South Seattle. And the woman who leads it sees it as a social justice and a racial justice organization as much as it is a tap studio. And they had the first recital they've been able to have in 3 years on Friday night. And my class of adults got to perform, which was agonizing. But it gave me hope because I saw so much beauty. You had tiny little kids and young adults, and you had middle-aged people like me. And there were all kinds it was Black people, Asian people, white people. It was like what I grew up with. And people were so affirming and connected and joyous in doing this thing together. And there was so much beauty in it. And that affirms for me that being connected and joy-filled gives me hope. So I hope we get more of that.
I love that story. And kudos to you for taking that on and seeing how hard it is and persevering. That's great. I hope it continues to be a blessing to you. So thank you so much. I just want to thank you again, our guest, Amy Sommers, for joining us today on this episode of Lean in Olympia. You can, again, check out past episodes of Lean in Olympia on our website at interfaith-works.org. And thank you for being here, Amy. I look forward to further collaboration with you. Thanks to all of you for watching this. Peace to you. And have a great rest of the day.